Hi, everyone, and welcome to Faith of the Fathers, this series of videos where we're looking over the church fathers, talking about how our doctrine was shaped in these early beginnings of the church and what was going on, and all the thought and all that fun stuff. So, now we're moving over to the western part of the world. We've looked at Origen and others over in the east. We have talked about some people in the west, but what we're going to start doing here is we're going to look at Marcus Minucius Felix, or Marcus, or call him Felix, any of those names. Anyways, he is one of the first to write in Latin that we have on record. So, one of the earliest Latin fathers, and he was an apologist. And the reason we say an apologist is because all the works that we know from him just happen to be books that defend the Christian faith. Now, there's actually only one of his works that survives to today. It's understood that he did write a second book. Jerome and Lactantius both talk about it. It's called The Case Against Astrology, but we don't have any copies of that. So, we do have the Octavius. Now, if you've never heard about this guy, Marcus Minucius Felix, don't feel weird or odd because he's not super popular. Now, there's some reasons he might not be. Well, his life story, we don't really know much at all about him. He wasn't really recorded by Eusebius and all these other. There's a few that talk about him, but not much. And it's possible that his work is really just largely copying from Tertullian's apology that he wrote. And so people kind of go back and forth, and he seems to not take a whole lot of importance. But I think he's kind of important. So he's situated in the late second century or early mid third century, depending on what kind of scholar you're following or what your argument is based off of. Some people think it's even as late as 258 that he was even possibly drawing from Cyprian. I personally think that he's in the late second century. I personally think there's reason to believe that Tertullian was copying from him and also Cyprian, where it was influenced by him as well. Now, the reason I think that is because of his fame in the fourth century doesn't seem to make a whole lot of sense if his main works were simply copies of other people's. Whereas, even if Tertullian is more or less a copy of this one, Tertullian had a whole bunch of other works that survived that we know about. So that's how he was important and famed. And his broader fame might have made him more popular than Felix or Marcus. So, this book that we do have is called the Octavius. Now, Marcus, who was he? Generally, we understand he probably was born in North Africa and later in his life moved to Rome to pursue a career in law and rhetoric, and hence why, if you read this book, you'll find a lot of similarities to Cicero. Just a side note, highly recommend reading some Cicero if you're wanting to understand the early church and how doctrines are shaped. Cicero, especially in the Latin writers, is very important. He keeps coming up a lot. So the um, let's look at the Octavius. What is it about? So this is a book of a conversation of three people that are debating about Christianity versus paganism. Now, Marcus is the main character, he doesn't really have a huge role in this, but he is the one who's writing this and recounting an event. He starts off with saying, I remember about the greatness of my friend Octavius. Then he starts to tell a story about these three friends who were walking around in Ostia, which was the port city near Rome. And they are walking towards the beach. So Marcus is walking with his friend Octavius, who is a Christian, and then also their friend Caecilius, who is a pagan. Now, as they're going, they pass a statue of Serapis, who is a goddess in that time and around that area. And Caecilius reaches out his hand and kisses the statue with his hand, does that motion, the reverent kiss to this statue of Serapis. At which point, then Octavius turns to Marcus and says, how could you walk around with such a debased and horrible person whose mind must be filled with stones because he worships stone? To this, of course, Caecilius was quite offended and gives him the silent treatment. And they discover that when they walk along the beach and find some kids skipping stones, and Caecilius is not amazed or entertained by this. So they say, what's going on? Caecilius responds saying, I'm deeply offended because such a horrid, ugly person who is a Christian, ugh, this horrid Christian would have the gall to mock me, a wonderful, virtuous man who worships the Roman gods. And so, of course, how do we deal with this? There's obviously this tension going on. And so they decide to have a debate to decide who is right, Christians or pagans. Now, we have Caecilius, who's going to first come out and support the pagan side, followed by Octavius, who will argue for the Christian side. Marcus himself will referee between the two because he's kind of the friend of each of them, the mutual connection. So let's look over Caecilius's argument, who has a bunch of points. I'm not going to be able to talk about all of them, but I'll talk about some big ones that he brings out. He begins his discussion on attacking the doctrine of divine providence, that God is sovereign and cares for all creation and his people. Caecilius appeals to Epicurean arguments and the atomistic flow, that all the atoms in reality, just like they flow around randomly. So there's obviously no sign of cohesion and a system to it. So God's not involved. Also, futility of tragedy, that bad things happen. How can a good God let bad things happen? So therefore, God is not in control. Divine providence falls apart. Then Caecilius moves on to discussing the Roman pantheon and the grandeur of Rome. Look what Rome has done. Look at the greatness of Rome and the wonder, beauty, and virtue of the Roman system and the beauty of the gods and how great everything is. How could you deny this? Everyone all over the world recognizes the wonder of the Roman gods and the Roman life. Also, then he turns now to a bit of an interesting argument where he says if you go into a church service, you'll see that vast majority of them are women. And we all know how gullible women are. So that's Caecilius. I don't agree. A very harsh, misogynistic argument there. But that is what he brings that up as his case. Obviously, that's not appropriate, but that's what he says. He attacks also Christian morality, the acts of what Christians do in their church services. He says he begins the argument to summarize it by saying such a wide variety of charges and very serious ones, they can hardly be repeated in polite company. And then he goes on to proceed to repeat these things that he has heard about the Christians. And there's an interesting thing. If you look up chapter 9, you can see his overview of that, where he describes the practice of cannibalizing an infant and then the people coming together in incestuous orgies with like full families, mother, father, children, everyone involved. That's what he believed. So then he attacks the doctrine of the final judgment, the end times, and the final resurrection, saying the resurrection is ridiculous. How could anyone believe that someone who has died would come back to life? That is just utter preposterous. Then he turns to back to Rome. Look at how great Rome is, how wonderful Rome is. And what are the Christians? Where are the Christians? They are oppressed and filling the prisons. So whose God is really more powerful? If Jesus were really this great God that the Christians proclaim, then why are his people in the prisons, and Rome, who denies this God, who killed this God on a cross, is the one in power? Right thing, it just look at the world around you, look at the political system. It doesn't make sense that your God is actually in charge. And he finishes with a summary of Socratic skepticism. So then he steps aside. Octavius now comes in and begins his defense of Christianity. Now, Octavius's reply to Caecilius, interestingly, he just basically goes through point by point on Caecilius's arguments and responds to each one, and kind of has an interesting response in defense of the Christian faith. And so he begins with discussing divine providence. Interestingly, he brings in the final argument about the Socratic skepticism with the divine providence, where he actually accedes to Caecilius's argument and says, "You are right." The point that Caecilius was making is that Christians claim to know too much about God. No one can know these things. And so Octavius says, yes, you're right. We are just people. We are human physical people, we cannot understand the spiritual reality and the infinity of who God is. He is so much greater than us. We can't know that. And so there's kind of this extreme thing. And then on the one hand, of claiming to know too much about how God controls things. But Octavius then points to the opposite extreme and says this is where Caecilius is, and it's equally as wrong. To say that just because we can't know all the details, therefore nothing, therefore there can't be providence, he says that's equally as preposterous. Rather, look at the world around us. It might seem through Epicurean eyes to have this random structure to it, but there is a structure nonetheless. The fact that life happens, the fact that uh, beings continue to procreate, the fact that plants grow, and how all these systems work together, and there's this necessary cohesion to it. Similar arguments are used today by apologists to defend that there is a God. Say, look at the structure of creation. There has to have been a God, a creator. Octavius isn't trying to argue for God's existence. Caecilius knows this. The pagans believed in gods. They believed in a divine creator. They just didn't believe that Jesus, or the triune God of Christianity, was that creator, or that he was sovereignly involved in creation. So he's actually using this argument to say, look, God must be involved, because how else could things be so systematically, so not so beautifully carried through in all this life? God must be involved. And so he kind of finds this middle ground of faith, that we don't know all the details about God because we're just humans, but at the same time, we don't deny it, we hold it in faith. And so Caecilius is wrong in, on either side of those arguments, and Christians don't hold to either extreme. Then Octavius draws heavily from Virgil and Cicero. Interestingly, his argument does not draw from Christian sources. He focuses really on Roman sources and things that they would find, that the Roman populace would find reasonable to depend on. And what he does, what he draws from these sources, is discussing the Roman pantheon, the Roman gods, and the life of Rome. Pointing out one of the things, he says, you think these gods are so great? Well, they were originally people who were just mythologized and turned into gods through the telephone game of 1,000+ years. And actually, this is a common argument among Christians. Augustine actually traces out this argument in his book, The City of God. If you want to find that, look up chapter 10 in The City of God. 9 and 10 is where you kind of see that argument fleshed out. So he also, Octavius also cites an example where apparently Alexander the Great met a priest who told him that as well. Anyways, moving on, the Roman grandeur. You think Rome so great, virtuous, and wonderful? Well, look how Rome was founded. Two brothers, Romulus and Remus, come together to establish the city of Rome, but there can't be two kings. So what happens? Romulus kills his brother Remus. So the whole system of Rome was founded on murder, on fratricide. That was the beginning of Rome. You really think it's that great? Well, if you still think it's great, well, what happened right after that? They needed wives, so there's a neighboring tribe, the Sabines. They went over, slaughtered all the men, and stole the women and forced them to procreate with them. You really think that's the kind of people that gods would bless? Really? Well, he even points out that he's kind of turning the tables too. He's looking ahead to his defense against the whole cannibalism and incestuous relationships by saying, you think Christians are horrid and evil? Well, look what you guys do. He even says, if someone were wanting to find a prostitute, you'd think you'd go to a brothel. But in Roman society, you have brothels, but you're more likely to find a prostitute in a temple than in a brothel. He says this: in fact, burning lust is assuaged more often in sacristan cells than in actual brothels. Yeah, it's pretty messed up. So if you really think Christians are, all these stories about Christians make us look bad, well, those stories aren't true. We'll get to that in a sec. But even if they were, Rome, you guys are way worse. Now, where do these stories about the Christians eating babies and copulating among family members, where does that come from? Well, that comes from demons, according to Octavius. He says, what happens is that they, the demons, slip into the minds of the ignorant. There they secretly implant hatred against us by means of fear. For it is only natural to hate, and, if you can, to molest one who makes you afraid and terrified. It is these demons who are constantly circulating such tales, and that the tales themselves are never investigated or verified. Look at that. Misinformation goes back even almost 2,000 years, and based on fear and hatred as being this impetus behind it perpetuating. So, what about the stories and this belief about Christians cannibalizing a baby? And this was then this how they understood the Christian practice of the Eucharist or the Lord's Supper. Octavius points out again, turns the tables on him by saying the only person who would believe that anyone could do that is someone who would do it themselves. Now, it's a bold statement, but he then says, well, look, I've observed your people doing this. Now, notice there he says, I observe. And what he said, what he's appealing to is his own personal experience that I've seen you do this. Whereas in Caecilius's argument, his main source of authority to say, how do you know that Christians do this? He says, I've heard it said. I've heard it said. People told me. I've heard it said. That's what he basically keeps citing. Octavius, on the other hand, says, I've personally seen this happen. What happens? People, what's called exposing infants, is where they would take a child, put it outside the city gates and just leave it there to die. Now, Christians were commonly known to actually go and gather these children and adopt them and raise them, which is part of where those rumors about eating the babies in the Eucharist came from. But Caecilius points out, you guys, like, first of all, Christians don't eat babies, but second of all, you just go off and kill your babies. Like, what the heck, man? And then he says that these practices, of course, derive from the examples set by your own gods. Now he cites then the story of Saturn, who ate all his children, and then the story of how Jupiter defeated Saturn. Anyways, moving on to the account of incest. How does Octavius respond to that? He says, one can trace the origins of these slanders rather to your pagan nations. Incest, of course, is a cause for pride in your traditions and your tragedies, which you take pleasure in reading and hearing. Likewise, the gods you worship are incestuous. Now, then he brings out that yes, Christians, we call each other brother and sister because we all are children of the same God and Father. We all call the same God Father, and so we are all co-heirs and brothers and sisters in the family of Christ, and in Christ, in the family of God. But that doesn't mean we have these like love orgies. Next, finally, the discussion about the resurrection, the final judgment, saying the resurrection is preposterous. Well, you really think that's a crazy, preposterous notion? Well, what about birth, right? What is more miraculous? For something that exists, that has just died, but still exists, even the Romans believe the soul went somewhere, the body's there, the soul is still existent, it's just somewhere else. So it's just basically reuniting the soul and the body. Okay, what's more miraculous, doing that or something that does not exist growing in coming into existence inside a woman's stomach, growing and coming out, right? Something that does not exist coming into existence obviously is way more crazy and miraculous than something that does exist just being reformed and and just continuing to exist in a new way. And so it's like the resurrection obviously is not that crazy of an idea. And whereas birth, just a new child being born, that is a crazy idea. And yet we see it all the time. So then he turns finally to Rome as the real power. Really, look what Rome is doing. We've got all these Christians filling the prisons of Rome. And yet I've now clearly shown you that these Christians are not criminals. They have done nothing wrong, deserving of being in prison. There is no reason. And so the only reason Christians are in prison is an unjust system. And it is injustice and it is false accusations and oppression that is doing this. So you think Rome is great by having this deep system of injustice and systematic evil? That's what Rome is founded on, injustice and systemic evil. And then that's the end of his discussion. And then all of a sudden it says that Marcus records, "For some time afterwards, we were so stunned that we could say nothing but kept our eyes fixed on him." His powerful, huge speech, and all of the other two are just like, wow. And then Marcus, as the referee, he's supposed to then decide who won the debate, which one had a better argument. But before he can say anything, Caecilius bursts out, "Heartiest congratulations, Octavius, my friend, and I congratulate myself as well. I need not wait for the verdict. We have both won in a sense. It may sound outrageous, but I claim victory too. For while Octavius is victorious over me, I too am triumphant over error." And so his point is Octavius won the debate, but Caecilius says, "I've now defeated lies and I've now come to the truth." So there's that powerful, wonderful, sort of cheesy, but still beautiful ending where all of them leave all rejoicing because Octavius won the debate, but then Caecilius didn't really lose because now he has found truth. And that's it for Marcus Minucius Felix. I encourage you to go and read this book, and I will see you next time with the next church father. Thanks.